Good morning. I want to start off today by telling you that if you tried to see this daily message yesterday and didn't find it, it is entirely my fault. I did not make a daily message yesterday, and the reason is very simple. I simply did not have time in the last part of last week and the first part of this week to get that done. I'm very sorry for that, but let's pick up where we are. We left Jesus with Peter, James, and John on the mountain right after that event that we call the Transfiguration. Those three apostles had just seen the most amazing thing that they had ever seen. Perhaps one of the most amazing things that anybody had ever seen. They had seen Jesus illuminated in some way here, and they had seen Moses and Elijah, who had been dead for centuries, and then they had heard the voice of God. I can imagine that they were overwhelmed with what they had just seen. I can also imagine that they were itching to get down the mountain and tell the other apostles, and probably anybody else who would listen to them, about what they had just seen. This was such an amazing event that they had to go tell somebody about it. But then, as they're descending, Jesus said to them that he didn't want them to tell anybody about this until he had risen from the dead. Okay, two things here. First of all, what? Don't tell anyone? Are you kidding me? How can they not tell somebody about this? How can they not go down and just immediately spread the news about what they had seen? How could they possibly keep quiet about that? Well, this brings up a question about whether they actually kept quiet about it or not. We really don't know. We know that on some other occasions, Jesus had done some miraculous things, and he told the people that were involved not to tell anybody about it, and they seldom were quiet about it. In the cases that we read about, most often the people immediately went out and started talking about it because they could not hold it in. Well, how much more so on this? There was just something that Peter, James, and John had just experienced, and how could they possibly keep quiet about it? Because they were just men like we are, ordinary people. I have a hard time understanding that they really kept quiet about this. My guess is that they didn't. But we'll never know until we get to heaven and we can talk to them about this. My guess is that it was just such an overwhelming experience that they could not keep it quiet. Now, we know that indeed Jesus had given this instruction before, but some things, how can you not talk about them? And so, I don't know, maybe they went back and shared with just a few people about this. We do know that when this whole thing had happened, that they were so filled with awe that they had already been ready to build an altar for Elijah and for Moses and for Jesus, but they were directed to listen to Jesus. What an event. What an amazing event. And then there's this other thing. What did he mean by don't tell anybody until he had risen from the dead? What is that? Now, we understand exactly what happened because we get to look back and read the whole story together. But keep in mind, they didn't. And rising from the dead? How can that be? Was he really going to be resurrected from the dead? Evidently, they weren't really convinced that that was a literal sort of thing, because we know that when Jesus was crucified and was dead and was put into the tomb, that these very apostles and the others really showed no signs of understanding that he was going to be resurrected. And so What a puzzling thing for him to have said. And they had to have talked among themselves about this. And even if they didn't share it with anybody else, Peter, James, and John had to have had further discussion about this. What does he mean by that? And then, as they're coming down, Peter, James, and John asked Jesus about Elijah. They had just seen Elijah. They had seen Moses and Elijah. And they were reminded perhaps of the prophecy that the prophet Malachi gave. We find it in Malachi chapter 4, verse 5. The prophecy that Elijah must first come, preparing the way for the Messiah was what that was all about. And so they were asking about this. They were believing, evidently, that Jesus was the Messiah. But what about this Elijah thing? Was this that they just experienced? Was this Elijah coming back? Or was there something else? Had he already come? And if he had, how did they miss that? Well, Matthew 11:14 tells us that John the Baptist was the fulfillment of that Malachi prophecy. And when John the Baptist came, they knew that was, well, now they are looking back at it, they were to be taught that was the fulfillment of this very prophecy that was given. And Jesus went on to tell them that not only had he already come back, but when he came back, that they, being the enemies, I guess, had done to him whatever they wished. Well, we know that John the Baptist was beheaded. He was mistreated because his message didn't fit into the narrative of the day. And so he was rejected. Remember that Elijah was kind of the representative of all the prophets. They had just seen him on the mountain, and Moses was representative of the law, and Elijah was representative of the prophets. And so now the prophecy was also being fulfilled that Elijah would have come to prepare the way for the Messiah. Well, they could kind of understand that perhaps. I don't know if they put together that this was John at that moment or not. But the prophecy had been made and the prophecy was fulfilled. Now, let me say this. This does not mean that Elijah was reincarnated in the form of John the Baptist. That takes us into an arena of theology that really doesn't make sense in the rest of biblical teaching. What it does mean, though, is that there was this prophecy of one who would come preparing the way for the Messiah. And indeed, that is what John the Baptist did. He was kind of a wild man out in the wilderness. And evidently so was Elijah. And so here was one representing the prophets, one coming in the form of an Old Testament prophet saying, the Messiah is here. That's what John the Baptist did. So, keep in mind, all of these things are happening as Jesus is moving on this timeline, getting closer and closer to getting back to Jerusalem, where that terrible week would unfold of all sorts of amazing things happening that we're going to get into before we go very much farther into this book of Mark. An amazing teaching that's leading us ultimately to an empty tomb. Thank you for listening. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Bye.
They resound with God's own heart. Oh, let the ancient words impart. Words of life, words of hope.